Hello and welcome to the Lewis and Clark State Historic Site. My name is Ben and I work here as a site interpreter. And today we're going to look at York's life after the expedition is completed. The Lewis and Clark journey will span over 8,000 miles, traveling for almost 2.5 years to the west coast and back. And at the end of it, on September 23rd of 1806, the expedition lands back in St. Louis. And that is a celebratory moment for everyone. Everyone of the expedition is relieved. They've made it back. They got all the way there. They accomplished most of what they set out to do. They only lost one person. Everyone else survived. And when they get to St. Louis, of course, their work's not done. They have to unload their bags, unload the canoes, and the captains start to sort out letters to send to Thomas Jefferson and their families about their success. And at that moment, we see a shift for York separate from all of the other soldiers. After the soldiers have dragged the last of their cargo out of their boats, and Sergeant Ordway will write that they are relieved until their pay. So they're going to get paid, they're going to be rewarded, and then they're going to be released from the army. They can go and do whatever they want. The situation is very different for York. As an enslaved valet to Captain Clark, he's expected to be snapped right back into slavery. Now, he was a slave for the journey itself, but he had a lot more opportunity and privilege on the journey. He worked just as hard alongside everyone else and probably felt a little more normal. It's not quite freedom, but when he comes back to St. Louis, he's snapped back into an institution where he is less than the people around him, he is less than William Clark, and he has to do whatever Captain Clark says. So while the soldiers are rewarded, York goes back into slavery, and the pay that's due him as a valet actually goes to his owner, William Clark. Now, that's not to say that this was not a celebratory time for York as well. As York is traveling with Captain Clark after the expedition, it seems that he was a very good storyteller. He would tell people about his journeys. People were interested in his experiences. And on their return back through Louisville, he's reunited with his wife after almost 3 years. So not all of this is bad for York right away, but he is snapped back into the institution of slavery. And that will start to chafe on him. You know, these soldiers are rewarded pay, land, they're given their freedom to do whatever they want now that they're out of the army. And in the reverse is York, who's Clark just assumes will go back to being a very helpful valet. York thinks that he's owed something for his service. And Captain Clark will even write that in some of his notes. The other problem is that York is separated from his wife in Louisville. Remember, she's enslaved to a different owner in Louisville, and while they're there visiting with Captain Clark and York there, visiting the rest of the Clark family, it's not a problem. York can go and see his wife. But as soon as Captain Clark takes on his new job in St. Louis, they're separated once again. York will beg Captain Clark and plead with him repeatedly to the point where Captain Clark is annoyed. He's asking Clark to let him go back to Louisville and work. He said, let me go back and work for your family, or hire me out to someone, or allow me to work myself and I'll send all of the money that I make back to you. He is doing anything he can so that he can be back with his wife. Clark, of course, is more upset by this than anything else. From when they got back in 1806 until about 1808, this tension is continually building. Eventually, in a letter to Jonathan Clark, Captain Clark will have these instructions in November of 1808. I shall send York with Nancy and permit him to stay a few weeks with his wife. He wishes to stay there altogether and hire himself, which I have refused. He prefers being sold to returning here, but he is serviceable to me at this place, and I am determined not to sell him, to gratify him, and I have directed him to return John H. Clark's boat if he sends goods to this place this fall. If any attempt is made by York to run off or refuse to perform his duty as a slave, I wish him sent to New Orleans and sold, or hired out to some severe master until he thinks better of such conduct. So the tone of this letter is that Clark is frustrated with York. He can't understand where York is coming from. He does allow him to go back to Louisville for a while, but there is this threat hanging over him that he could be sent to New Orleans, which is a terrible place to be sent as a slave. The term sold down the river, especially to New Orleans, means that you're being sent down to a place where they treat slaves even harsher than they do where you're from. And so Clark is threatening to put him into a terrible form of slavery. And if that's not the case, to be sent out to some master, well, he'll be abused and treated harshly. So York seems to get what he wants in going back to his wife, but he's treated pretty harshly. And what we know from letters back to Captain Clark from his family, he is treated pretty roughly by some of the people he's rented out to. York does get to see his wife for a while, until Clark calls him back to St. Louis, and he seems to behave for some time in Clark's mind, until a point in 1809. And I have this letter from May of 1809. York brought my horse. He is here, but of very little service to me. Insolent and sulky, I gave him a severe trouncing the other day, and he has much mended since. Could he be hired for anything at or near Louisville? I think if he was hired to a severe master, he would see the difference and do better. So again, Captain Clark is not happy with what York is doing. York is stripped away from his wife once more, and when he shows that, he expresses that, Clark is annoyed, and again wants him hired out to a harsh master. He actually beats him, as you can hear in that letter entry. So this relationship, this very close relationship between Clark and York, has really soured, and York is really taking the brunt of it. Later on in 1809, Clark sends York back to Kentucky the last time, and in a letter, he kind of just washes his hands of York. Basically, he has it to where Jonathan and his nephews will take out the hiring of York, and he can do whatever he's done with him. From there on, York will do all sorts of odd jobs. He will do a wagon driving business for Jonathan Clark. He will be hired out to some different masters for different labor. But eventually, tragically, in 1811, York will lose his wife, separated for the final time. He'll never see her again after 1811. Because it's at that time where we find out in a letter to Captain Clark that York's wife is moving south to Natchez. And at that distance, being enslaved in Kentucky, York will probably never get to see her again, which had to have been heartbreaking for him. After that point, everything on York gets really hard to tell. There are some oral traditions that say York eventually made his way west, either being freed or escaping west to live amongst some of the American Indian tribes. But what we do find out from Clark in 1832 is he claims to have freed York, and for a short time he worked in Tennessee and Virginia. This information on York that comes from Captain Clark comes in a conversation that's documented by Washington Irving. So the famous American writer Washington Irving is visiting St. Louis. He has a meeting with Captain Clark, and among his notes is a conversation, a discussion of his servants. Clark will claim that he freed York at some point, and that he put him up in a drayage business, a wagon shipping business between Richmond in Virginia down to Nashville, Tennessee. So this back and forth work is very tough, and Clark says that he wasn't very good at it, and that he preferred to come back to be enslaved under Clark again. Now this does follow that old slave owner trope where the slaves would be better off under me. So it's hard to say how sincerely York felt that he would be better off enslaved again. What we do know is that it takes some time before he's freed, probably in the late 18 teens, early 1820s, and that around that same time, maybe after a few years of freedom, struggling as a free man in a slave South, he dies of cholera in Tennessee. So York's final years after the expedition's completion is not a happy experience. He's forced back into slavery. He clashes with his owner, who he's also grown very close with. He's separated from his wife permanently. And while he is possibly given his freedom by Clark at the end, he is treated very harshly, and eventually he dies a very sad, sick death of cholera. York is lost from history for a time. He's kind of ignored in the journals and the notes and the writings of Lewis and Clark. And when he is portrayed, it's usually as the slave caricatures. He's either inept or corrupt or this buffoon that is there to entertain the captains. And it's not until much more recently, say in the last few decades, that York's life has been re-examined. York's been given a lot more credit due him that is obvious in the journals. And also in 2001, one of the last acts of President Bill Clinton was to posthumously reward the rank of sergeant in the U.S. Army to York. I think it's important to look at York's life and understand his place, to understand the relationship that he and Clark had, the brutal effects of slavery from that time period, because it does give us a fuller understanding of the time period in which the Lewis and Clark expedition is taking place. I would encourage you to check out our Facebook page and our YouTube page, and of course you can always visit us at www.campdubois.com. Thanks for watching.